He arrived in London on Monday, stepping off the plane with a calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. Calm enough for the cameras to see, for the public to believe. But anyone looking closely, anyone trained to notice the slightest tremor in posture or hesitation in the step, could see it. Prince Harry was back in the city that had once been home, yet now felt like a battlefield. The air was thick with anticipation, thick with judgment, and he was walking straight into it. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What no one expected, not the journalists, not even his own legal team, was how quickly the tension would shift from simmering to something almost unbearable. This wasn't just another royal visit, not another photo op or charity appearance. This was a courtroom, the UK's highest court. And for the first time in months, Harry would confront the consequences of actions, decisions, and yes, allegations that seemed almost unreal until they were right in front of him. Conspiracy, fraud, dishonesty. The words alone had a weight that made even seasoned reporters pause. The courtroom itself was a paradox, cold, formal, almost antiseptic in appearance, yet layered with human emotion that threatened to spill at any moment. It was a place designed for control, for reason, for law. Yet on this day, the law seemed to ripple, to quiver, under the gaze of history and a global audience. There was a strange symmetry in that. A royal, trained all his life to hold composure, now facing the raw unpredictability of legal scrutiny. And the irony? He wasn't alone in feeling the weight. Every photographer, every reporter, every legal clerk sensed the fragility in the air. Something was coming, something no one could fully anticipate. You have to ask yourself, why now? Why would this case, of all cases, escalate to this level? Harry has battled privacy invasions before, sought justice, and maintained his dignity through years of relentless media scrutiny. And yet, here he was, standing at the threshold of a verdict that would not only challenge his legal team, but threaten to fracture the careful narrative he'd spent a lifetime constructing. There is a subtle terror in that. Not in the courtroom walls, not in the accusations themselves, but in the realization that control is a fragile thing. That even a prince, insulated by title and security, can be exposed to the full glare of public judgment. The morning had begun quietly, almost deceptively so. Harry's arrival was accompanied by the usual fanfare, a blur of cameras and flashes, yet he moved through it like someone trying not to acknowledge the storm gathering behind the next doors. Reporters scribbled notes. Photographers shifted to catch the royal expression, the small telltale signs of nerves. And yet, beneath it all, there was a tension that no amount of protocol could mask. He had returned not merely to fight a case, but to face something far more insidious, a court full of witnesses, lawyers, and observers who knew how to read every twitch, every pause. What made this situation unprecedented was not the charges themselves, though conspiracy and fraud carry their own historical weight. It was the convergence of personal and public scrutiny. The cameras outside, the whispers inside, the subtle nods between lawyers, all of it formed a web that was impossible to escape. Even the most carefully rehearsed public statements, the meticulously crafted royal appearances, the charitable gestures, and humanitarian headlines, none of that mattered now. In the court, as in life, evidence, perception, and the unexpected testimony carry far more weight than public relations. There's a certain poetry to this sort of tension, and Harry, whether he realized it or not, was standing at the epicenter. How many times had he faced tabloids, the press, invasive photographers, and still maintained composure? And yet, this was different. Something about the courtroom, the combination of legal authority and intimate exposure, made everything unpredictable. There's a lesson here, perhaps, about vulnerability. Even someone with his resources, with his upbringing, can face moments where the walls close in, where judgment isn't just abstract, it's immediate, personal, and profound. We can't ignore the human element, because it's what makes this story resonate beyond royal fascination. Every step, every hesitant glance, every subtle gesture is a reminder that behind the title, behind the headlines, behind the image carefully maintained for years, is a person confronting real fear. And not just fear of losing a case, but fear of what the case represents. Reputational damage, betrayal, exposure, the fragility of carefully constructed identities. How do you reconcile your private life with a public persona that seems to demand perfection at every turn? And what happens when the world, through cameras, microphones, and the scrutiny of legal proceedings, forces that private life into a spectacle? This trial, like all trials, isn't just about what is legally proven or disproven. It's about narrative. And Harry's narrative, painstakingly curated, was suddenly at the mercy of a court that has its own story to tell. Every witness, every piece of evidence, every slight inflection from a lawyer or judge contributes to the unfolding drama. And there is irony in that drama. The more someone seeks privacy, the more the world wants to intrude, and the more weight the smallest actions carry. And yes, there are contradictions here. Harry, a man who has fought tirelessly for the right to personal privacy, is now accused of acts that, if true, suggest the very opposite: collusion, dishonesty, strategic manipulation. How do you square that with years of public statements, carefully measured appearances, and charitable work? How do you reconcile the image of a principled prince with the human vulnerability that this trial exposed? And more importantly, what does that say about the world we live in, where perception is nearly as consequential as fact? There's also a subtle, almost imperceptible tension between expectation and reality. The public expects the prince to emerge composed, dignified, perhaps even victorious, as he has in the past. Yet the reality, as observers would soon witness, is more complicated. The courtroom strips away layers of polish. The cameras capture not the carefully rehearsed expressions, but the fleeting moments, the pauses, the suppressed breaths, the micro-expressions that betray fear, uncertainty, and even disbelief. It is, in a sense, an exposure of the very humanity that his royal persona has long tried to mask. The legal team, for their part, were acutely aware of the stakes. Every document, every argument, every procedural move mattered more than anyone could measure. And yet, even the most seasoned lawyers can only control so much. You can prepare endlessly, rehearse, cross-examine, and advise, but the unpredictable nature of testimony, of human reaction, of judicial discretion, these are variables no one can fully command. And when those variables collide with the personal weight of reputation, history, and familial legacy, the result is a tension that feels almost unbearable. And it wasn't just Harry who felt it. Observers, journalists, even casual viewers around the world could sense it. The atmosphere was thick, heavy, almost oppressive. People leaned forward, unconsciously holding their breath, aware that something significant, perhaps unprecedented, was unfolding. Because courtrooms, especially ones involving the royal family, are rarely just legal proceedings. They are stages where narratives collide, where private and public interests collide, where consequences ripple far beyond the room itself. And yet, in that wait, there is an undeniable fascination. Why do we watch? Why do millions tune in, scouring headlines, reading live reports, analyzing images and footage frame by frame? Perhaps it is because we recognize, even from a distance, the stakes of human vulnerability. Because we see, in someone like Prince Harry, the universal tension between who we are and who the world expects us to be. There is a mirror there, a reflection of our own fears, our own struggles with exposure, with judgment, with the unpredictable twists that life throws at us. But the tension was only building. The cameras flashed as he walked into the courtroom, the whispers of reporters mixing with the quiet shuffle of papers, the subtle rustle of gowns and robes. Every movement was observed, every expression dissected. And in that room, for a fleeting moment, the world held its collective breath. Because the unthinkable wasn't just a headline. It was imminent, and everyone knew it. And then the first glances were exchanged across the courtroom. The judge, stern and unreadable, met Harry's eyes briefly, a moment that seemed to stretch, that seemed to carry more weight than words ever could. Lawyers adjusted papers, witnesses settled into seats, and somewhere in the room, an unseen current shifted. It was the kind of moment that signals the beginning of a storm. One that has no respect for rank, for privilege, or for expectation. And we're left with the question that will haunt the next hour. What happens when the storm hits? How does someone trained to manage appearances, to anticipate the world, react when faced with the impossible. Because even before the verdict, even before the evidence was fully presented, the fragility of human composure was already on display. And in that moment, we realize something essential. The story is bigger than a case. It is bigger than a prince. It is about accountability, exposure, vulnerability, and the strange, often cruel theater of public life. The first thing you notice when a prince returns to London isn't the fanfare, the flashes, or the crowd. It's the atmosphere. It hangs in the air like a fog, barely perceptible at first, but thick enough to make your skin tighten. On Monday morning, that atmosphere was palpable. Prince Harry stepped off the plane, a figure both familiar and strange to the city that had watched his life in painstaking detail. The calm on his face was deliberate, careful, almost rehearsed. But the slight twitch of a hand, the subtle hesitation in his step, betrayed an undercurrent that the cameras could never fully capture. For weeks, London had been abuzz with speculation. Legal analysts weighed in on every possible angle. Tabloids suggested outcomes ranging from the improbable to the catastrophic, and social media churned with predictions, accusations, and, inevitably, jokes. But nothing could prepare anyone for the tension of seeing him walk into the city, fully aware of what awaited him. The court, the media, the court of public opinion, and the personal reckoning that comes with being accused of conspiracy, fraud, and dishonesty. The airport was a theater of contrasts. Reporters jostled for position, microphones extended into his path, cameras clicked relentlessly. Security personnel moved like shadows, discreet yet unyielding, creating a corridor of controlled chaos. And through it all, Harry moved with a practiced precision. His suit was impeccable, his posture measured, but there was an unmistakable edge to his movements. A man who has spent his life managing perception knows how to control what the world sees, but London that day was a city ready to read between the lines. Every step, every glance, every barely audible sigh became a statement, a puzzle piece in a narrative that was already being written by thousands of unseen hands. Inside the car that would take him from the tarmac to his temporary residence, the silence was heavy. Not the polite, reflective silence of a contemplative traveler, but the charged silence of someone who knows the storm is close. His aides whispered updates from the legal team, papers shuffled, phones pinged with breaking news alerts. Harry listened, nodded occasionally, but the mind behind the composed exterior was calculating, anticipating. Even a momentary lapse could be seized upon, twisted into a headline, broadcast across the globe, and dissected endlessly. And yet, there was a moment, brief but telling, when he allowed himself a small glance out the window. London rolled past, the Thames, familiar streets, the monuments he had walked by countless times, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed normal. But it wasn't. Not anymore. The normality of the city clashed with the abnormality of the day's purpose. He wasn't here for a charity event, or a public appearance, or even a family gathering. He was here to face a court, and the weight of that confrontation pressed down with a subtle, almost invisible force. When he arrived at his residence, there was little fanfare. A few cameras, a smattering of journalists who had tracked his every move from the airport, and the discreet presence of security personnel who moved like shadows against the morning light. He stepped inside, removed his coat, and for the first time allowed a flicker of exhaustion to show. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind that comes from carrying a burden of expectation, of reputation, and of an almost unbearable scrutiny. For years, Harry had managed the public eye, navigated the treacherous waters of tabloid media, and maintained an image of control. But control is a fragile thing, and London had a way of stripping it away. The day's events were meticulously planned, each movement coordinated to the minute. Legal consultations, strategy sessions, media briefings. All designed to prepare him for the inevitable confrontation with the court. But even in preparation, there was uncertainty. The allegations were serious, the legal environment complex, and the public's perception unpredictable. Each brief, each document, each carefully worded statement could tip the balance, and the awareness of that possibility created a tension that was almost tangible. As evening approached, Harry stepped outside briefly, not for cameras, not for statements, but to breathe. The city seemed quiet, almost indifferent to the storm that was building within its walls. But he knew better. Every familiar landmark, every street corner, every shadow held potential witnesses, potential commentators, potential threats to the narrative he had worked so hard to construct. The calm of the evening was deceptive, a fragile veneer over the reality that tomorrow would bring the full force of scrutiny and judgment. Inside, the legal team convened. They reviewed documents, discussed witnesses, and mapped out strategies. Every word, every argument, every potential line of questioning was weighed against the possibility of public exposure, media misinterpretation, and legal missteps. Harry listened, contributed, and absorbed the gravity of the situation. Even surrounded by experts, there was a sense of isolation, a recognition that, ultimately, the courtroom would judge not just the facts, but the man himself. The next morning, the air outside the court was electric. Reporters lined the streets, cameras poised, microphones extended. The public gathered, some curious, some judgmental, all aware that history was unfolding. Security personnel moved with precision, creating barriers, managing access, and maintaining a controlled environment. And then, Harry arrived. Walking from the car to the court entrance, he was immediately the center of attention. Flashes erupted, voices called out, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to a single point. The prince stepping into the courtroom, fully aware that what happened next would be scrutinized, analyzed, and remembered.